It's time for a Dirt Daily. And once again, the dirty 80 series LandCruiser is going under the knife. Last time, I fully admit, I kind of phoned it in. I didn't really do a very hard project. Last time I just deleted the flares, ripped off the rear bumper, dropped the old spare tire. But this time, serious work's getting done. It's gonna go in the shop and get new suspension, bigger tires and wheels. But first, because I'm working on the 80 series, that means this episode is brought to you by onX Off-Road. onX Off-Road, it's an app. You put it on your phone, it has maps on it, it has off-road trails, it has places to go camping. It lists the trails based on tire size and like, are you going overlanding or rock crawling, yada, yada, yada. It's got a lot of cool stuff. Plus, it has a setting where you can find landowners. So if you get the landowner deal, then like you can, if you see a trail, you can find out, hey, is that trail legal? Or you might see a truck like an 80 series LandCruiser sitting in somebody's yard, and you can track down the landowner and get a hold of them and say, hey, do you want to sell that truck? Which is exactly what I did when I bought this. And if you sign up for the Elite program, you get discounts with other Elite program vendors. So sign up for onX Off-Road today. Use the 4xFred discount so that you get a discount when you sign up. I'm going to put this thing in the shop and take those tires and wheels off and tear it all apart and hopefully put it all back together by the end of this episode. Let's go to work. So I'm taking these wheels off, just blasting them off, and then of course I have this problem right here. So first thing we do is we look in the glove box. So we'll just come over here and we'll look in the glove box, because that's, or you can look in this side pocket, there's nothing in there. Nope. And so we'll just come in here to the glove box, and I'm sure it's in here. And there's a whole bunch of papers. There's some fuses, and it's not here. But of course, the tool to remove the lug nuts, the locking lug nuts, is not there. So we don't have the tool to remove this. So what we have to do, I found a 3/4 inch 12-point socket. It's kind of a cheapo one. I'll put it on this extension. I'm going to line it up with that, and I'm going to just hammer that thing on there. Then put your impact right on there, and it comes right off. I will tell you, I mean, it's not very convincing to even buy these things. I'm sure that would slow somebody down if they were trying to steal your wheels. Now is the real problem, which is getting this out of the socket. And you're gonna have to get in there probably with a punch, set this like in the vise, and just hammer that until that comes out. It'll come out, and it may also screw up this old socket. So if you do this, you might need to find some sockets that are kind of expendable. These are the old tires on the LandCruiser. 16-inch wheel. This is a 275/70/16. There's 4 tires on it, but they don't match. They're about a 30-inch tall, pretty worn out. But this is what it's gonna get. These are, oh, come back here, you. Old little tires, new Kenda 35 1050 17 on some white Nomad wheels. I think these are really cool looking. Plus, most of the time when you get a 35-inch tall tire, they are a 1250. These are a 1050, which means they're skinnier. Overall, I think it's going to give it a cool look. The white wheels, I wasn't really sure about it, but I think now that I've got the tires on it, I'm pretty stoked on it. These are the new Kenda MTs. So it's a mud tire, and the sidewalls are super gnarly. I think that'll look really cool. It'll give the LandCruiser just the look I'm looking for, plus big tread voids, cool sidewall tread. I think it should be a pretty good tire. It is time to dive into the suspension on the LandCruiser. It should be a really simple install. There's literally 4 coils, 4 shocks, a steering stabilizer, and some camber adjustment on the front. That being said, this is a 94. This truck is almost 30 years old. It has over 300,000 miles on it, and there may be things that are rusted solid. You might need to use an impact or some heat. I also have just noticed that this rear axle brake rotor is covered in gear oil, which means that the hub seal, because this is a full floater rear end, the hub seal is probably wasted on it. And before I go and bolt shiny new tires and wheels on it, I'm gonna have to replace that just because that's the way I am. I can't let this thing spray gear oil all over my new wheels. So let's dive into this. I'm gonna start on the rear. It should be pretty simple. I'm gonna have to loosen up the sway bar bracket, then I will probably loosen up the track bar and remove the shocks to let it droop out, take the old coils out. And when I do all this, I'm going to have not only a support under the rear bumper so that this thing has support front and rear of the axle, but also I'm going to use my transmission jack that I use that has its brackets that can hold an axle so that everything is supported, nothing's going to fall, crush my foot or head or any of the things in between my feet and head. The rear shocks and the sway bar kind of hold the axle from drooping out. So you have to get those off, plus you're going to replace these. Now the bolts at the bottom of the shock screw into a threaded hole on a bracket on the axle. And those can be notorious for breaking off, so you got to be very careful removing that bolt. At the top, there's a bracket that's held in with 2 screws that thread into the bottom of the frame, and those also can break off. So especially if you have like an East Coast truck that's pretty rusty, be careful backing those out. Luckily, it's a West Coast truck, not as much rust, and I sprayed them down really good with WD-40 for a couple days before I tore into it. So everything came off nice and easy peasy. With the shocks and the sway bar disconnected, I can drop the axle and hopefully remove the coils. But I've drooped it out so far and the axle has not come away from the coil. So I'm gonna come in with my impact and remove the track bar. Now I'm removing the track bar to give the axle a little bit more room to move. This should allow the axle to droop out a little bit more than normal. And hopefully I can get these springs out. This is the new rear coil spring. It's an Old Man Emu lift that we're installing, 2.5-inch lift. There are some isolators that go on top of the coil. The one on the passenger side stayed up in there. The driver's side one fell out. So you're going to want to put that back on to help reduce noise between the suspension and the chassis. Also, this is going to be a taller coil, so you need to try and flex the axle down. I've already removed the track bar. I went in and removed the brake line bracket that attaches to the axle, and now I have to wrestle this thing up inside there. One more thing, the coils are located per side, so this has a little tag on it. The tag will have an A or a B. A is for Australian driver's side, which means A is going to go on the passenger side, B will go on the American driver's side. So now we just have to kind of feed this up inside here and then wrestle the axle housing down so that we can get the coil into place. So this is where you just have to kind of muscle the housing down. Oh. Come on, you. I'm gonna get the coil up and over this hump that is on the axle and then rotate it into place. This is the part that would definitely be easier with a second person. All right, there we go. That means one is in place, which is good. Unfortunately, we have another one on that side we have to wrestle in. And then you just have to pull down on this and twist. Well, bam. Huh. Got it in. No problem. Let's talk about shocks. This is the rear shock off of the LandCruiser. And as you can see, I can compress it by hand, but it does have some charge still left in it because it is moving, coming back to full length, which is pretty good. I'm assuming this is the factory shock, 300 some thousand miles, almost 30 years, and it's still working okay-ish. We are gonna upgrade. This is Old Man Emu's BP 51. The BP stands for bypass. The 51 stands for 51 millimeter bore inside the body of this shock, which is basically about 2 inch. So it's about a 2-inch body shock. The bypass system is set up so that as the vehicle is going through its range of motion, the fluid can bypass by the piston, and it's all adjustable. You can adjust the compression and the rebound. You can see it right here. You can adjust these rings and it will ramp up depending on what you want your setting to be. How do you decide what your setting should be? Well, I watched a video where they interviewed Stu, one of the suspension engineers at Old Man Emu and ARB, and he basically said, install it at the setting that it comes, drive it, see how you like it. If you want to play with it, crank the rebound or the compression, crank one of them all the way to the other end and drive it. And then basically find an area where you can kind of test it. You can drive it with full compression, you can drive it with full rebound, you can crank them either way. And once you figure out like the ends of the spectrum that these adjustments affect the vehicle, then you can fine tune it and crank it in a little bit, depending on how much weight you're hauling. If you have like a big old bumper on the back with a spare tire hanging out the back, do you have a big bumper on the front with a winch and a bunch of lights? Do you have a rooftop tent? All of that stuff is going to affect how the vehicle drives, and you can tune the shocks through this compression and rebound setting to kind of help you with that different load. And you may be changing this depending on terrain too. If you're driving in sand, you're driving in long rutted roads. These guys, I've been to Australia, I've gone on adventures with the people from ARB. The type of trips that they design vehicles for are long, long desert trips through big sandy washes and rough rutted roads. So they spend a lot of time tuning the shocks to figure out how they want it to be set up. But not everybody lives in the outback. So you might just be going up to a cabin in the mountains, or you might be out in a field herding cattle and you're driving through ditches and ruts and everything. So feel free to fine tune this as you like. But for now, let's get this thing installed. Basically, I've already put this bracket on the top. This is the bracket that came off the old shock. The bottom comes with some new fasteners, new washers and everything to assemble this. And then this piece is a guard that will basically protect the shock shaft. It's kind of flopping around right now, but it will lock into the bottom piece and then move up and down as the shock compresses. But that'll keep gravel from smashing into the shock shaft as you're bombing across the Australian outback, mate. All right, this thing goes right up in here. Rear suspension's all buttoned up, new coils, new BP51s. There's a bracket here that goes between the sway bar bracket and the chassis, and that is where you mount the reservoir for the shocks. You run a reservoir on these types of shocks so that you have more oil capacity. The more oil capacity, the more the heat from the shock working can be dissipated. So the oil that is in the reservoir and in the body of the shock can dissipate heat, plus you have a larger volume of oil. So everything's back together, track bar's back on, and I think it's time to move to the front of the truck. So the front suspension is very similar to the rear in that there's a coil, there's an external shock, and there's a sway bar. However, the front also has your steering, which is the drag link and the tie rod. Notice how the tie rod is actually on the back side of the axle. There is a track bar like in the rear, but what's different is that the front has these bars, which are your radius arms. So radius arms are basically like bars that reach underneath the axle and hold it in place. So like each of my thumb and my finger is basically like a bolt that bolts through a bushing to the axle housing. Now in the rear, there's like a lower arm and an upper arm, and as it moves, the axle can kind of twist. With the radius arm, as the axle moves up and down, it doesn't twist as much. It seems to just kind of follow the arc of the radius arm. This is good in a lot of ways because it actually helps kind of reduce body roll. It kind of binds a little bit and helps keep the vehicle kind of level. Some people don't like the lack of articulation on radius arms. I think the mixture of radius arms on the front and the 4-link with the track bar in the rear seems to work out pretty well on the LandCruiser. I don't know that Toyota really invented this setup. I feel like it's kind of a spin-off of what Land Rover did originally with the Range Rover. I think the Range Rover was kind of the first to develop the radius arm setup and the 4-link in the rear. Okay, I started by undoing the sway bar bracket that attaches the sway bar to the chassis. I also disconnected the brake lines from the chassis so that as the suspension droops out and everything comes out, nothing gets stretched. Next, I need to lower it down and disconnect the top of the shocks. That's actually inside the engine bay, and then we'll raise it back up and do the bottom of the shocks and finally be able to pull the shocks and the coils out. I don't know if I told you guys, but I replaced these air struts. I had mentioned on a prior video that the struts were no longer holding, and one of the viewers was like, hey, go to this website, you can order them really cheap. So I did, and I replaced them, easy peasy. The thing works much better now. This shock bolt on the passenger side is pretty easy. You just reach underneath here and grab the shock body. And it falls right out. The one on the driver's side is buried underneath the master cylinder, so I'm gonna need to maybe put a swivel on my impact. I disconnected the top of the shock. I'm compressing the shock down so that I can get it out of here. There's a stud on the bottom. Put your impact on there. You throw all this old hardware away, and then just reach up in here and compress all of this, and it will come right out. There you go. These shocks also are holding a charge like the rears, but I'm gonna toss them because we have new and improved ones. Shocks are out. To get the coil out, I'm gonna come in here and remove the track bar bolt. That will help the axle move a bit more by having one less link to bind everything. Track bar is out. We can lower this down. Keeping an eye on brake lines, vent lines, and then droops out enough to get the coil out. Then, like in the rear, we're gonna put the coils in. Remember, the A marked coil is for the Australian driver's side or American passenger side. Next, I'm going to install the shocks. This is a front BP51. You kind of have to feed it up through the shock mount and then work down from the top because it has a pin style mount. So this goes up through the mounting hole, and then you're going to kind of blindly reach over the top and get it all started. Putting the bushing on, and then the washer, and then see if we can get that nut started. There we go. It's a little bit precarious because you're working inside the wheel well and then over top as well. But they have an impact. You can hold the body tight and then tighten up the nut on the top. After you get the top in, you're going to want to droop the axle out as far as you can and get the bottom of the shock into its bracket. Be really careful at this stage because the brake lines are stretched. It's definitely on the driver's side. So you kind of need to do this, lower it down, and then maybe even flex it out a little bit. There it goes. And then as soon as you get the hole lined up, jack it all back up again so it's not hanging on those brake lines. Once the shock's in, you need a spot for the reservoir, and there's a bracket that uses 2 bolts that are already a part of the coil tower. You have to remove 2 nuts off the top here. Then this bracket will actually slide over the reservoir and then over the head of 2 bolts that stick through the bracket that's on the coil mount. So this, just have to line these up. Tape measure. The next step of the install is a little bit wonky. Basically, your front axle, because the vehicle has been lifted and the radius arms have gone down, the caster of the front axle has kind of rolled forward. And you don't want that. You want the caster to lean back. And because it has rolled forward, it's going to be a little bit more twitchy on the road. And the Old Man Emu kit comes with these bushings. And these bushings, if you look closely, you'll see that the bushing in the middle is not centered. They're offset. And there's actually 2 of them for each radius arm. And one of them goes up and one of them goes down. And what that does is, in effect, roll the axle back. Now, the instructions say, and I quote, "After raised suspension system has been fitted and while vehicle is on flat surface," which it is now, it's sitting on jack stands with the lift, "mark the vertical through the center of the front original bushing at 90 degrees to the horizontal line on each leading arm." And the way this is shown is basically they run a straight line from the bolt at the back of the radius arm to the top of the bushing on the front of the radius arm. And that's about a 40-inch long straight line. But unfortunately, you can't do that because there's an axle tube that sits right in the middle of that straight line between these 2 bushings, right where my finger is. So, I was like, well, how am I supposed to get this straight line? And then I looked online, and the general consensus is you just take a plumb bob on the front bolt of the bushing, and you just hang a straight line off of that, and then you mark that point, because that helps determine how you clock the new bushing into the arm. It's a little bit confusing, it's a little bit wonky, but I think that is going to be our best option, is to just use a plumb bob. I don't have a plumb bob, but I have a piece of string on this piece of wood, and I will hang that. And then I will use a paint pen to mark the arm. And I'm going to mark both sides, but we're going to pull both arms simultaneously and swap the bushings at the same time, and you really just want both of them to be identical side to side so that the axle isn't like twisted or wonky. So we're going to get one side set up with the front bushing up and the back bushing down, and the equal distance between the holes, just like factory, and that should in effect roll the axle back and give us some caster back. So a little bit weird, but I think it will make sense. So there you have it. That white mark is what I just put on with a paint pen. That is in line with the string that's hanging like a plumb bob off the center of the bolt on the front of the radius arm. And that should be our starting point, because these new bushings have a mark right there, and that mark is supposed to press into the radius arm in line with that mark that I just added. So now we pull the arms out and we start pressing new bushings in. There, front radius arm is out. There you can see my little paint mark. I did have to put the screw jack underneath the exhaust because the bolt was smashing into the catalytic converter, which ironically on this truck lives outside of the frame rails. So you might run into that problem. And now the next step is we press these bushings out. This is how I press the bushing out. There's a piece of tube underneath the arm, and then there's a socket and a spacer. The press is kind of old and janky, but the idea here is that I'm going to just press the metal center bushing and just rip all of the rubber out of the radius arm. I'm going to replace all of this, so it doesn't really matter. I want to get the rubber material ripped out, and then I can come back in and remove the sleeve on the outer edge. So then you're going to put the radius arm in your vise. Just ignore all the mess of the workbench. I know I need to put everything away. And you're going to come in here with a Sawzall and ever so gently cut through the outer ring of the bushing. You want it to pop in like that so that it will come out of the radius arm. There are tools that you can get to press this out. I don't have that tool. I think Slee Off-Road makes it, or you could machine a piece of metal down to fit perfectly on that. This is kind of the butch way to do it at home, but it gets it done. Let's see, go a little bit more. And once you hear it kind of grab onto the blade of the Sawzall, that means you've probably broken through and it should be able to be knocked out. Then you just grab a hammer and a punch and kind of work it out. Where the heck is my hammer and punch? I'm losing my mind. Here we go. Once the outer sleeve of the bushing is cut through, it'll collapse and you can pretty much just knock the thing right out. That's pretty good. I knocked it right in the trash can. Then we'll come in with a die grinder that has a little polish wheel on it. Give it a nice little polish. There you can see that is where the new bushing is going to go. Guess I could wait for the air compressor to stop running. There you can see the inside, nice and clean. The front one, I got a little bit aggressive with the Sawzall. I put a little nick in it, but it should be fine. Just clean it up, make sure it's nice and smooth in there, and then we press the new bushings in. So this is how I start. I got the bushing lined up. You can see that mark on the front bushing and the mark on the radius arm. And I just kind of used a rubber mallet and got it started just enough so that it sits in there square, and then I'm going to put it in the press and then I'll press it in. Then we have to line up the other one. That's not that hard if you have both radius arms out. We have one bushing pressed into the radius arm. We need to put the other bushing in the radius arm, but we have to be careful that the spacing between the bolt holes is identical to what it was when it came out of the truck, because if they're not identical, it won't bolt back into the axle. So how do we align the second bushing with this bushing to make sure that distance is the same? Well, there's a pretty easy method. You're going to take the other radius arm off the other side, put it on your workbench, and put some really long bolts through it. Bolts that are tight, just like the factory bolts. So this is set up, it's level. Then you're going to take this radius arm and notice how the front bushing is aligned up. Well, you want the back bushing to be aligned down. So down towards the bottom of the arm. To do this, we will set it over the bolt, and then we will bring in our second bushing, which is basically the same. It has a little mark on it. On the one that we put in first, that mark was down. This one, the mark will go up. And to align it, we'll slide it over the other bolt. Wiggle the arm around until it just kind of seats down into the radius arm. And that tells us that those bolt hole distances from side to side are the same as the axle and the same as the old radius arm. Plus, if you look at this, it has the radius the radius arm kind of moved up a bit, which makes up for the lift, but also gives us the caster back into the axle. Next, we'll come in with our hammer and we'll just kind of tap this in around the edges so it seats, and that should be good enough. Then we can take it over the press it in for good, and then repeat all the same steps for the other. Once you have one radius arm with both offset bushings pressed in, it's really simple. You just redo everything again to the second radius arm. Press out the center of the radius arm bushing, take your Sawzall and cut a little slit in the metal casing of the bushing, and then this will fall out. Then grab your radius arm, polish up the inside a little bit so there's no sharp edges, and then just lay this radius arm over top of the first one you did. Drop a bolt down through this end and take your other set of offset bushings and line them up with the set that is already in there. This will, in effect, set up the caster so that it matches on both arms. Double check that everything is kind of lined up on the outside. All the bolts look good. Take your little hammer. Give it a few good taps around the outside edge. Take this bolt out, slide that up off, and now go press these in, and you will have both radius arm bushings set up. Just like that, both arms ready to go back in the truck. Grab your radius arm, put the front bolt in, put the rear bolt in, and then you will adjust both sides to get this backmost bolt in. I think we're just gonna, looks like it needs to go up just a hair. Nope. There it goes. Well, bam. Bolts are all started. We can go through and put all the nuts on those. Probably want to do that at ride height, or at least torque the rear ones tight at ride height. I think the front two can be tightened up right now. There is one little piece left. This is a spacer that goes in between the sway bar and the drop link. Oh, and there's also a steering stabilizer that we'll bolt on right before we're all done. And that just about concludes the install. We'll have to go through and tighten everything, make sure all the fasteners are torqued and tight. New steering stabilizer, new coils in the back, new BP51 shocks in the front and the rear. Double checked all the bolts on the radius arms, looked over all the bolts on the rear, made sure all the brake lines have been tightened back up. I think it's time to put this thing on the ground and put the wheels and tires on it. I'm really stoked to see it on those Kendas. I know I said I was gonna fix that rear axle hub, but two things. One, I think I will get it out of here and get some pictures of it, and then I can turn it around and face it back in and fix that hub for a future episode. But pretty stoked to see how this thing's gonna look. Let's drop it down. I think this is gonna make this truck go from looking kind of like a turd to looking like a turd on some really cool tires and wheels. I rolled these Nomad wheels up here and I figured out pretty quickly that because this front axle has a drive flange and the rear axle is a full floater with an axle shaft, you have to remove the center caps. Not really a big deal. I'm not really a center cap guy, but I know some people would rather have that look. Then the next thing I figured out is that these wheels have some space around the wheel studs. This is what you would really want. This is an ET style lug nut. Has a taper, but it also has a little bit of a flange there to fit into the wheel. I have one of these. So I ordered a full set, and for now, I'm just gonna put 3 of the old lug nuts on. They fit, they'll work. I'm not gonna be test driving this on the highway. I'm just pulling it out to take some pictures and turn it around. And I don't have a full set anyways because this truck had those locking lug nuts on that we had to get rid of. So, I don't know, I think it looks pretty good. It's kind of a neat style. Let's put it on the ground. I think it's pretty cool. It's still kind of ratty with faded out paint, bent up front bumper, but 35-inch tall tires, 2.5-inch lift really makes it look a whole lot different. Bypass shocks, which I'm really excited to try out once I get all the right lug nuts and everything dialed in. It's sitting a little high in the rear, but I think once it has rock sliders and a rear bumper and spare tire, cooler, tool bags, all the stuff you take wheeling, it might settle down. If not, we'll look at some different coils for that. Overall, pretty stoked on this little LandCruiser. That's it for this Dirt Daily. We'll see you guys next time. Don't forget to use the 4xFred discount code if you sign up for Onyx Off-Road.